courts. It was meant for having IT infrastructure in the courts. It was meant for buying equipments in the courts to ensure that we have at least 47 high courts, at least a high court in each county. After my tenure at the judiciary, I went back to a setting mode. And I remembered that I loved election. And my mind took me back to election. And then chairman of the African Union, Her Excellency Dr. Dlamini Zuma, was having a program of election observation and recruited me as a coordinator of elections with a specific allocation of countries within Africa. Because in a year you will have one election or two elections running in a country, and my work was basically to go around those countries to monitor and observe elections in those countries. I took the job seriously, and that job changed my perspective on election, because I was able, as I speak now, to do about 8 countries in Africa, 8 countries in Africa on elections. Every year I'll do an election. Some countries I'll go there twice. And my responsibility when you are in that institution or when you are in that position as a coordinator of election, you are working with the EMB of that country. You are auditing the entire electoral process in that country. At your fingertips, you have what we call the electoral cycle, and you are auditing to know whether that country has complied with the international standards, whether that country has complied with the regional standards, and whether that country has complied with the domestic standards, and whether that election is good or not. In between that period, so a number of countries I did under the African Union, but in between that period, the East African community developed a similar model. And then in 2016, I was privileged to be then hired as a coordinator, again, in charge of long-term observers, short-term observers, staying in that country for almost 2 or 3 months, and that's normally the model that operates. And I was hired by the East African community to manage the general election of the Republic of Uganda in the 2016 general election in Uganda. That's under the East African community, and I can see the flag of EAC there. In 2021 election, just after the COVID, the Carter Center, under the leadership of Jimmy Carter, gave me an opportunity to go and manage the elections in Zambia. And the elections in Zambia at that time were done under COVID structures and COVID mechanisms. So I was in Zambia for about 4 months, managing the election in Zambia on behalf of the Carter Center. As I said, I've been privileged to do 8 elections.
Did you say managing or observing?
As a coordinator of election, you are basically managing that election on behalf of the person who has taken you there, but at the same time you are observing. So you are working very, very closely with the EMB and reporting regularly on the challenges, hiccups, and that you are checking there. So you are basically hosted by the EMB of that country. Around that time, I realized that apart from the 1997 election, I hadn't done much in Kenya in terms of active involvement in election observation and election management. So the Standard Media Group came up with an election consultancy, and I was lucky to be on that team again, focusing mostly the 2017 election, focusing mostly on the technology of election and the voter transmission of the election. That was my focus when I was working at the Standard Media Group. So on a consultancy basis. So I knew exactly where the challenges are. Chair? I have experience at my fingertips when it comes to auditing an entire electoral process. I know what happens on voter registration. Like right now, I know where we're going to have a challenge on voter registration. I know the basics of solving that problem. I remember that a former head of state, who was my head of mission in the Zambia election, now is the president of Ghana. That time he was in the opposition. He told me, make it simple. Election is not complex. Make it simple. If you remember the decision of the Supreme Court on the nullification, if you remember, Justice Mwilu was asking...
I think it's fair enough for your introduction. You speak to those other things around elections as we go by.
Most obliged.
Yeah, allow me to ask the Vice Chair to also ask you a question.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, Mr. Kakai, I've heard you mention that you have done a lot of electoral observation within Africa. That's right?
That's right.
Out of your experience, and of course your experience emanating from your entire career, what are the competencies that you have picked, skills and disciplines that are outside the legal profession that you can use to steer the IEBC to the next level as a chairman?
Thank you for that question. As you observe elections, and I said 8 countries have consolidated certain skills and in essence acquiring them as now my call of nature in terms of election. One, you need to understand administration. In the countries and in the places I've visited, I've been able to understand that an EMB can easily mess the election if the administration, the governance structures of that institution, and the management of that institution is lacking. That is a skill that I want to import and try it here if I'm lucky. The other skill that I've been able to know is the governance skills. In most of those institutions, you realize that during election, things become so hot, and you need to have somebody who brings in these soft governance skills to minimize or reduce the chances of conflict. That is something that I want to leverage on. Another skill that I want to bring is that I have a background of human rights. And in elections, I want to see what is the human right component that we can bring in this institution. Why do we see some members of the IEBC losing their lives, dying, and there's no scheme to compensate them? These skills are what I want to bring, innovate them from other countries. I've seen them working. I want to see how this can work. And these are the skills that I want to bring over and above my legal training. Finally, I want to bring a skill of reform. I've been privileged to do reform in terms of following up on every year's election report whenever a country does the election and ensuring that those recommendations that have come from those reports find their way in the legal reform, in the policy reform, or in the administrative reforms. That is the skill that I think I have and I want to bring. Finally, Chair, Those are hard skills, but they're also soft skills. You cannot manage an EMB if you don't have soft skills of how to manage it, if you don't know how to have synergy in an organization, if you don't know how to be a team player, if you don't know how to manage conflict, even the slightest of the conflict, you must have those soft skills, and I possess them. Thank you.
Mr. Kaikai, do you think that having mediation and arbitration skills is important for the job that you are now here for?
Yes. As a lawyer, I also participate in mediation. And if I reflect, for example, if I may answer that question with the help of experience, if I remember the last election, if there was any attempt for mediation, it will have solved what we witnessed. So mediation is a critical tool that a chair of IEBC can utilize. And you can call in any mediator to help if you can't mediate, but it's a softer tool of assisting to calm down things.
Thank you, Mr. Kaikai. Now, to just conclude, please tell this panel whether in your journey, in your career journey, you have had an instance where you have been tested and your leadership skills have come through at a point where there have been maybe an instance of pressure and conflict and maybe external influence.
On election, I said that I've done 8 countries, and one country, without naming that country, we were doing a report, and the report wasn't looking very good on them in terms of participation of women in elections. It was really bad, and they didn't want that information, that we try and see how we can make the report subtle, because they did one negative report. That's a test on your integrity as a person. It's a test on your integrity as an observer. And since all of them are the one charged with doing the reports, I said we can't do that. We all witnessed that participation of women is limited. There are very few women, yet you have a legal framework that allows you to have women participating, but you are not utilizing the legal framework because of the cultural imbalance in that country. That is one thing that I was tested.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Allow me to ask Karo Kituku to also engage you in some questions. Thank you, Karo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good afternoon again, Mr. Kissinger.
Good afternoon.
I would like us to have a conversation around the area for political parties and parties primaries. This is because, as you may know, political parties, if you're successful to become the chairperson of the IEBC, will be your biggest stakeholder. So there is this contention and there is this problem that has always been experienced each electoral cycle on party primaries. That there are challenges that come up with nomination processes, pre-elections, and I would like you to explain to us what you think is the problem and the gap that exists in that area, and how do you intend to address that gap should you become successful?
Thank you for that question. Every political party in this country has a constitution. Every political party. These political parties are registered by the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties. The law has allowed the PPLC, the Political Parties Liaison Committees, to take a very critical role in managing of political parties. Now, the conflict of and primaries are basically an election in the electoral cycle. And then IEBC has a very big role in dealing with the political parties. Now, the interplay between IEBC, the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties, and the Political Liaison Committee take a very central role in terms of managing and coalescing around political parties. Now, the biggest problem with the political parties comes with, one, their respective constitutions. And what do they say in the constitutions when it comes to coming up with a party list for their candidates who are going to participate in that election? That is normally the biggest problem. The biggest problem being they do not rely and try to ensure that probably the gender rule is observed in those primaries, number one. Number two, the issue of PWDs is not observed in that list, and the issue of women and minorities are not observed on those issues. So that is where normally the problem and the anarchy and the confusion appears whenever political parties are doing their primaries. So to navigate around that issue, and of course the issue of funds in terms of allowing women to participate, to contest an election, and it's a very confusing thing. So to manage that conflict within the political parties there has to be a very strong stakeholder engagement of the political parties themselves to relook at their constitution and their rules in terms of nomination. The other thing to do is to tap on the skills of PPLC, which is by law one of the conveners in terms of bringing together political parties and as well as the IEBC. Number three, IEBC to have very strict rules on when to accept this list or not to accept this list. I know that one of the contention is the female, the male, and the minorities and the PWDs. Although we do not have a proper framework to ensure that political parties comply with the party lists to be gender sensitive, you still have to think of other means and ways of coming up with a representative list.
Thank you for that. So, what in your view is specifically the mandate of the IBC to ensure that the political parties operate within the legal framework during the nomination process?
The IBC, by law, is required to liaise, coordinate, and operate together with the Registrar of Political Parties, because the Registrar of Political Parties is the one that's appointing them. But at the same time, the IEBC at the same time is supposed to be, they have very strict guidelines on how those political parties are supposed to behave, how they're supposed to deal with. You look at the Political Parties Act, if they're supposed to comply with those regulations and the rules under the Political Parties Act to ensure that they comply with the law.
Does the IBC have any obligation to supervise the political parties' nominations?
Yes, it has.
Tell us more about that.
It takes me back to the question that I was saying, the interplay between the political parties, the Political Parties Liaison Committee, the IEBC, and the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties. So the IEBC will comes up with rules to ensure that the political parties comply with those rules in terms of nomination, the rules for nomination. And if you fail to comply with those rules of nomination, then there are consequences to that.
Okay, so again, another area related to that is on the campaigning financing. There is no law currently in Kenya that guides the financing of campaigns. So what would you propose to be measures that can be undertaken by ABC to regulate that area?
Thank you for that question. The campaigns finance, there's a campaigns finance law. It's called the Campaign Finance Act of 2013. What happened is that when that act came in place, the law was silent. Who comes up with what we call regulations? So we have the act in place and a detailed law, but we do not have regulations that support that act. This matter has been litigated for your information, and there are several courts that have opined on this issue. And the courts have said that you do not need Parliament to enact regulations. So the solution, and it will always be a problem in Kenya, we are going into election in the next 2 years, it will be a problem. The solution to this, if you remember what I said, simplicity, is to allow IEBC to do its work and IEBC to come up with the regulations on finance campaign which will supplement the Finance Campaign Act of 2013.
Who should allow? Is to allow.
The law.
Who should allow?
Chair, the law allows IEBC to come up with finance regulations. So IEBC has to do its work. It's only through that that you will have an election that is contested fairly, because finances is an important thing in elections. Thank you.
So if you have looked at the 2022 post-election review report, it has identified some of the significant challenges that exist in the conduct of party primaries in regard to transparency and fairness. Now, should you be successful and you become the chairperson of the IBC, what specific measures would you propose that would be put in place by the IBC to enhance the integrity and credibility of the nomination process for parties?
I think, thank you for that question. Then the simple answer comes to one, serious stakeholder engagement of those political parties, IEBC, PPLC, ORP. First thing. Number two is to look at the nomination rules that exist and identify various gaps that are there to enhance electoral process. And when you are looking at these nomination rules, you must ask yourself whether those nomination rules speak to the spirit of the Constitution. What is required in the Constitution for nomination, what is expected of the Constitution in terms of nomination, the outlook, and whether those rules speak to the Constitution and the spirit of the law. Those are the tangible things that I will have to deal with.
Maybe your views, we use technology in voting. What would you propose? Like, what do you think should happen? Can we promote the use of technology in party nominations?
Thank you. We have KIMS kit. And this KIMS kit starts all the way from registration, voting, all through to candidates, and then the transmission of results. So it's a comprehensive system. Now, the use of technology is something that we must continue aspiring to do. And we need to come up with a new platform or a new portal or a new system to ensure that even the technology is used during the party primaries. Because even we are looking, and I'm a student who says that even we need to be moving to have technology doing the AI technology. Well, voters, how do you reach out to these voters and you don't have money for voter education, because countries never fund for voter education? Can we harness that to use AI? We've seen AI doing very well in India and doing very well in the US. So technology, there will never be a deficiency of using technology in an electoral process. And technology answers that question of how simple is that election.
All right, thank you. And lastly from me, what should you become successful, what would be your vision for the use of ICT and basically modernizing the electoral system in Kenya for the next 10 years, 5 years? You can take us gradually, 5 years, 10 years. What is your vision? What do you think the ICT should look like?
We must start by priding ourselves as Kenyans for having an ICT platform in an electoral process. So where we are okay. What we need to do, and my vision will be, what are these other IT platforms or IT-related ideas that we can add to the election to make it more transparent to make it easy and to make it accessible to everybody. For example, why can't we have IT being incorporated in voter education? Why can't IBC come up with IT in voter education? We focused more on results transmission. And most of the energies for Kenyans were focused on results transmission, and particularly the presidential. But we left a lot of IT space. So we can have that. Technology doesn't just mean the computer. It also means social media, any other facilities that are using technology, Twitter, X, Facebook. How can we use these things to ensure that IEBC is 100% IT friendly? And these are some of the things that will be my vision, to ensure that from the button of your phone, you can ask a question, for example, what is the name of my polling station? That's use of technology. And then it will come and tell you your polling station is this. How do we enhance that? If you want to know about your civic rights or your voter rights, it should be at the palm of your hand. So we can encompass these things and enlarge the IT scale in terms of election management and observation, and in terms of election preparedness throughout the electoral cycle.
So as a last follow-up question, then what would be the use of technology in detecting and preventing electoral malpractices?
Thank you. The electoral malpractices are many, and the law establishes them. And one of the electoral malpractice is misinformation or disinformation, for example, because there's so much that goes out there which is not true information about really what's happening. So depending on the IT expertise that will be there, and depending on the program itself, then it should be able to detect and block that which one thinks is a problem. If there's a misinformation coming in, for example, you can have, before the election, you can have an information like, oh, a certain candidate has died, and therefore there will be no election there. And so that will depress the person who is coming to vote. So can we have a system, and that's entirely within the ICT department of the IEBC, that now tries to sieve and say this is not true, and the only true information reaches out to the voter. So IT is something that is expensive, though, to have IT systems in place, but I think it's a worthwhile cost.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kissinger. I wish you the best, and thank you so much, Chairman.
Thank you. Allow me to ask Dr. Koki Muli to also engage you some questions.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good afternoon, Kakai, and it's truly nice to see you. I actually had forgotten that we had offered you a job, but I'm really happy, as we kept on saying then, and we keep on saying here now, it's actually about the country, and any contribution that we make towards democratization process is contribution towards value addition to the process. So I'm very happy that you actually, I remember the conversation around whether to work for IEBC or not, the election management body. At the time, it used to be better than now. And therefore, we are actually quite happy that you could be as one of the applicants to be here to be interviewed for the position of chair. So karibu sana. I wanted to put you at rest and also to tell you that you have mentioned that you managed 8 elections, e.g. in Uganda, in Zambia. I wanted to know exactly what you did with the EMBs to manage the processes, and also for how long was this assignment?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Koki, for that question. One of the main responsibility of a coordinator of elections, whether you are hired by the African Union, by the East African Community, or the Carter Center, or any other observer group missions, your work is to pitch camp at the EMB. Your work is to carry the electoral cycle with you and tell that EMB, this is the electoral cycle that you are supposed to respect, that you are supposed to adhere to, with the view of having a credible election. You camp there. You then start evaluating as a role each step of that electoral cycle. Did that EMB, election management body, miss anything on voter registration? Did it miss anything on candidate registration? Did it miss anything on campaign finance and campaign issues? Did it miss anything on voter education? If it did, you then identify those issues that were missed, and those issues form your recommendation. As I said, my responsibility was to come up with a mission report, and therefore it forms your recommendation to help that EMB manage future elections in a better and transparent manner. You also, as a responsibility, give them guidance, advice of where you think they ought to improve. You check them. We call it checkmate. You check them. You also warn them that don't go that direction, go this direction, because the law allows you to do that. Finally, it was my responsibility to read the entire constitution of each of those countries you are in at the given time, and to read the entire legal framework in those countries, and then advise them based on the legal framework. So that was basically the responsibility.
Thank you very much, Kakai. You also you mentioned to us that you are also bringing in some skills in reforms. We are very concerned, of course, about the perennial problems we have, the challenges we experience every election year. There are always problems associated with acceptance of election results or challenge of the same, especially presidential elections since the 2010 Constitution. We want to have a rebirth, to have a country where the election management body, i.e. the IEBC, that if you are successful you will chair, must midwife a transformative process that gives us election results that are accepted by all contestants, and that within a peaceful environment where the election is professionally conducted, and so on and so forth. So if you are successful in this position, there will be a lot of work that requires to be done to achieve what I've just said. So with those transformative and reforms skills that you are bringing in, identify for the panel the 3 priority challenges that face the electoral democracy environment in Kenya, or that the 3 challenges that the IEBC faces in advancing its work. Just 3 challenges, and then outline for us how you prioritize them and how you will address them to give Kenya that dream destination I've just described. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Koki. One of the biggest challenges from where I sit will be you have so many gaps in the law. And those gaps have been taken care of by judicial decisions, but those gaps have not found themselves in legislation. That's a very big challenge for the IEBC in terms of reforms. How do we deal with these gaps? Are they doable within the shortest period of time? Is it something that will go into the next election with these legal gaps? I'll give an example on the greatest reform challenges we have. We are lucky that we have the Elections Act, which is, I think, over-legislated. But we have a constitutional challenge that we'll have to deal with as we go toward the next election. How do we deal with the issue of boundary review and delimitation? We all know that the timelines has expired. That's a very hot potato in the room. How are we going to deal with this? The issues of protected constituencies. So that's one of the biggest things that we have to look into. As we deal with the reforms, we also have to ask ourselves, how are we dealing with the issue of credibility as a big challenge for IEBC? Year in, year out, we are told that the institution is not credible, for good or for bad reasons, for known or unknown reasons. You are going into another election. You have 2 years to election. As chair, if I'm lucky, how will I enhance and ensure that that issue of credibility is dealt with? Because it all begins with the issue of credibility. What advantages do I do? What do I do to go about it? And how do I bring stakeholders in place to deal with it? Finally, the other challenge I foresee in terms of this is the lack of IEBC Act. The lack of IEBC Act Section 18 allows the formation of the IEBC Fund. We don't have it, and the IEBC Fund will have been good to ensure that those monies that are not coming from the exchequer are acquired from other development partners to enhance the electoral process. So those are some of the issues that I can touch on, and I've tried to say how I can deal with them in terms of reform and in terms of lobbying and negotiating with relevant institutions to ensure that there's proper legislation and things take place for the purpose of having a credible election.
Thank you very much, Kakai. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Allow me to ask FCPA Tanui to also ask some questions.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Bwana Kakai. Now, let me start. I was looking at your documents, and I saw that at some point at the judiciary, you are the accounting officer. What circumstances are, and at what point did you become an accounting officer for the judiciary?
My substantive position at the judiciary was a deputy chief registrar. But at some point, or at some time, the then chief registrar exited. And as they were seeking for a replacement, an institution, any institution in this country, will always have a temporary person as an acting accounting officer. And therefore you are limited. The terms of reference are, you are not a full accounting officer, your terms are just limited for holding the position. So you don't incur anything. You don't approve any payment. You only spend what was approved by the former accounting officer. So it's an interim measure which is normally put in government to ensure that there's no vacuum. So it was for a very short period of time without the authority to incur.
Now, with that experience of being an accounting officer, you will note that other than Teacher Service Commission, the other constitutional commission that has the highest allocation of funding is actually IEBC. So what would be your role as a chairperson of IEBC with regard to management of financial resources of the electoral management body?
Thank you. If I happen to be the chair, I hope I will, of IEBC, my responsibility is not that of an accounting officer, because IEBC, being an independent institution, has a CEO. The work of a CEO is basically the accounting officer. My responsibility as chair will be oversight. You oversight the operations of the CEO or the secretariat. My responsibility will be policy. You form and come up with the policies with the help of the other commissioners, and you do that. The only issue that the chair has in terms of controlling the accounting officer is if you look at the corporate governance of IEBC, which happens to every other institution, is you have a commissioner from for example, IEBC, you have 6 commissioners. You have a commissioner sitting in various committees so you have 6, IEBC I think has 9 committees, HR, IT, and audit and the rest. So you'll have a commissioner sitting there. It is that commissioner who will be sitting as a member who will give you briefs in terms of corporate governance and accountability mechanisms that are enshrined on the CEO. So the chair only receives it at plenary, those reports, but you are not involved at all with the day-to-day operation in terms of an accounting officer. The only part you get involved is when probably the accounting officer briefs you and tells you we need to go to Bunge and push for more funds, we need to go to this and lobby for more money, we need to have these development partners who are coming in to give us funds, but you'll have policy briefs in terms of your role. So your role as chair, you restrict yourself to your lane to avoid unnecessary squabbles within the institution.
Now, following it up or down, because you've said as a chair there will be a commissioner responsible for finances and reporting.
Sitting as a committee in that committee.
Sitting in the committee. And I would assume they should be like the finance committee. And I think there are 7 committees at IEBC.
Correct.
So there will be a commissioner. So what will be the role of this commissioner in this specific committee? And I want to follow that with the the last petition of 2022 elections, and there was one of the senior counsels who made a statement that it is not the work of commissioners of IEBC, whether in majority or minority, to procure services. So what would be the role of that commissioner in any of the committees that will be set up?
One of the good practices of governance and corporate management, even if you look at Mwongozo, for example, is you cannot leave the CEO, who is the accounting officer, to run the show alone without oversight. Remember, one of the responsibilities of the commission is to oversight. The only way you oversight, in my view, will be sitting in those committees. You need to know, for example, if they are procuring ballot papers. Was the law followed? Was the best bid awarded? Are all the procurement regulations followed? Are all the financial regulations followed? Are we in line with everyone? Have we sought for opinion from the Attorney General or whatever it is? You need to be there. Now, your role there is therefore only oversight and knowing what's going on. Remember, the spokesperson of the IEBC is the chair. So if the chair is not represented at committee level by his commissioners, how will he then be a spokesperson to speak about what? So that commissioner in plenary will give the report to all the commissioners that I sit in HR. These are the challenges in the HR committee. How we are solving in this committee is like this. So we are moving forward. I sit in ICT. We don't have proper documents, or we don't have proper systems for the next election. We want to purchase systems. You are feeding to the chair. So if chair is asked by members of the fourth estate, he will say, I am aware what's happening and I'm oversighting. So you can't ignore it. And that's why we need to have synergy in that institution. The role of the chair, the role of the other commissioners vis-a-vis the CEO, you work together.
Now, that is your proposed way, but the reality on the ground, which is actually confirmed by Public Accounts Committee and even the Auditor General in the various audit reports, is that there have been instances where the commissioners and even the secretariat have had conflict, either in procurement process, and we've had cases, I think they cited even the KIMS kit, the procurement of KIMS kit. So as a reform expert, because you've told us one of the skills that you have are reform related. So how would you address that? Because the reality on the ground is that there have been issues of conflict between commissioners on procurement-related matters with the Secretariat. Thank you.
I will take them through mwongozo as a starting principle. Number two, I don't think it's in the interest of any commissioner to go there and start getting involved in the nitty-gritty details of mismanaging or managing the affairs of the committee. I think, and sometimes it's very difficult to legislate some things. Some things is just common sense, and some things is just, what is this in humanity? You cannot legislate everything. You cannot have policies to everything. One needs to know that my role and responsibility as a commissioner is to know how we are dealing with, for example, ICT system. And the only way you know is to be in that committee and informed. But then when you are there, you need to keep your lane and know that my responsibility ends here. You are there for the good of the country. Because unless you oversight, suppose the CEO missteps, suppose you are not aware that we don't have voting materials in place on time, who will explain that? You need to have, you are in the kitchen. You are not cooking, but you are aware that elections is going on and you want to understand where we are. So the reason why that is there in terms of corporate governance is just synergy, relationship, and communication, which is being enhanced from the Secretariat, the day-to-day running of the institution, and coming to the policy oversight and legislation. So I think that it's difficult to reform that area. It is just recalling and telling people to do the right thing.
Now, I've heard you mention about mwongozo severally, Code of Governance. Is mwongozo applicable to constitutional commissions and more so IEBC? And secondly, in light of the ruling, there was Engineer Kamau, if you followed the case of Engineer Kamau, the CS, Jared Ngilu, with the EACC, where during that time there were no commissioners at EACC, and they were prosecuted, and they went to court, and they said there were no commissioners at EACC. And in that ruling, it is actually said that the commission is the commissioners. it is not the secretary, so that there can never be a commission without commissioners. So looking at Mwongozo as a code of governance, to what extent then is it applicable to constitutional commissions? Thank you.
Well, when you look at the history of Mwongozo, and if my history serves me well, Mwongozo came in as a code of principles, and it was one of the key recommendations in the Kriegler report. We all remember that Kriegler came in this country for specific duties and reasons. So in my view and my understanding, Mwongozo has very nice tenets and principles there, and those principles come or flow in with the spirit of the Constitution. So it will still be applicable to any independent commission and has gained prominence in the public sector. So there's nothing wrong, and the IEBC cannot be limited to the tenets that are enshrined in Mwongozo, because it's all about transparency, accountability, fairness, and just how you manage the board meetings, who signs the minutes. If you have an objection, why should you write an objection? There's a book that you sign into, and so forth. So these are principles that we can't wish away and are applicable to the public sector.
Lastly, you did mention about the Campaign Financing Act, and you did mention that the regulations are yet to be, is it enacted or approved by the National Assembly? What did you?
The regulations,
yes,
are supposed to be enacted, drafted, enacted by the IEBC. National Assembly has got no role in the regulations.
So I believe you must have done your background study before you came for this interview. So what is the status of those regulations? Have IEBC drafted them? Have they ever been presented before the National Assembly since 2013 when the Act was enacted?
I wouldn't know, because that issue was live in court. So this is guesswork. There's a possibility that IEBC was waiting for directions from the court, because this issue has been litigated in court. By the time the court was making an opinion that the National Assembly is not involved in regulations, I'm not so sure whether IEBC has now enacted them. But I'll also assume that probably they're in draft form, ready, but they are waiting the commissioners to come in and then officialize them. I tried to look at, in my research, I tried to look at the website, and I noticed that they didn't even have the current strategic plan. So probably it's one of the issues in the current strategic plan if the new commissioners come in. So my guesswork will be, I'm not sure the status. I don't know whether they are ready or not ready, but all I know is that the new commissioners will have to deal with the campaign finance regulation in the shortest time possible before the next election. Thank you.
Lastly, related to regulations, I think under the Statutory Instruments Act, the National Assembly normally says that all regulations have to be presented before them for approval before implementation. Yeah. Does that apply for constitutional commissions, and in this case IEBC, that requirement?
Again, when you look at that ruling, and this is where many courts come up with different rulings on this issue, and sometimes Kenyans get a little bit confused. But unless that ruling has been appealed, I'll stick to that ruling. And the ruling was to the effect that IEBC has full mandate to prepare regulations without involvement of the National Assembly. So I will stick there. I'm not so sure whether the lawyers appeal or whether there's an appeal on board or not. But at the same time, I know how important it is because the National Assembly are politicians and they are stakeholders. So I know how important it is to have stakeholders engagement through those regulations, because there has to be something called public participation. So my assumption then will be that when they came up, or when they will be coming up with the regulations, there will be some public participation, and that public participation will then involve politicians, and politicians will have a say, because you can't rule away the involvement of politicians. So as much as our law is very descriptive, as much as
Kameme TV. Once upon a time, one day in August 2022, everything fell apart.
Hereby declares that Ruto William Samoei.
We are not at Bomas of Kenya because we cannot take ownership of the results that is going to be announced.
Involved and interested parties went to the Supreme Court.
This also turned out to be no more than hot air, and we were taken on a wild goose chase that yielded nothing of probative value.
Uchaguzi ambayo imekuwa naita free and fair ni 2002. Hiyo peke yake.
The fallout was grueling, just like the reconstitution of the electoral body, which is ongoing. And now, the selection panel is up and running. Who will they select?
Picky poll.